pause just a moment or two and let some folks sign on. It's good to be back with you. Gonna start up in just a second. Let me know if you're joining in. Would love to know who's joining us today. Would love to get your questions and comments. Please just put them into the chat pane. All right, it looks like we're ready to go. I think the technology is working today, which is really cool. I appreciate it when things go according to plan. So, hello, welcome back. I'm Jim LaPierre. This is Sober Now. Today's topic is stop projecting and start receiving. Projection, we tend to decide how other people will view us. We tend to project our insecurities. We tend to project the judgment that we fear others will come to. And if you're anything like me, you have a nasty habit of preparing for the worst and leading with that quite often. So that's taken a lot of work for me to allow other people to have their own opinion, their own truth. And I think quite often how people perceive us is, of course, very, very different than how we perceive ourselves. We tend to have a very distorted view of self, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We were taught a lot of things that weren't true. A lot of what was instilled in us growing up created a very warped distortion. And we'll talk a lot more about that. Of course, what we project is a huge barrier to receiving, and most of us are terribly uncomfortable receiving something as simple as compliments. Sadly, receiving love, receiving affection, these things often feel unsafe to us. And again, I would love to get your questions about that. I would love to hear your comments, what your experience is with those things. We are streaming today on Sober Now's Facebook page. If you haven't been over there yet, please take just a moment and look us up. Give us a like. Get those notifications and updates. Doing a lot of cool things these days. Also, welcome to our friends who are joining from choosehelp.com. Wonderful resource for all things related to addiction recovery. And several other platforms as well. So really happy to have you all with us today. I'm going to share with you a couple of memes that were sent to me recently because I have a warped sense of humor. So for all of my clinical training and expertise, I most often quote Facebook memes. A couple that were sent to me recently that are really on par with today's topic. For my next trick, I'll confuse emotional unavailability with chemistry. I've seen that one circulated by a lot of young women in my life. And the second one that actually just came in from a dear friend, the meme says, essentially, people like us who are lonely often chase after emotionally unavailable people because those fleeting moments of connection are reminiscent of the inconsistent connection that we experienced with our parents and with other members of our family of origin. We tend to gravitate towards the familiar. We tend to travel in the same patterns, and my experience is everything that we truly want, everything that we're truly seeking is very healthy, but we tend to seek it from people who don't have it to give. And so obviously that's problematic. But if we grew up with emotionally unavailable people, then we oftentimes look to them to meet our needs. We gravitate towards such people, not just romantically, but also in terms of friendships and in other parts of our lives. It's simply what we know. It's simply what we're most comfortable with, it's consistent with our way of being. So unfortunately, we also have a nasty tendency to look for the best in others and the worst in ourselves. There's so many ways in which our self-image is distorted. I like the way that Bessel van der Kolk conceptualizes this. Van der Kolk is certainly one of the world's most renowned experts in trauma recovery. And he says that working with survivors boils down to three important themes. And those are very, very simple. The first is the false belief that I am not good enough. The second is the false belief that I am not lovable. And the third is the belief that I am not safe. And the importance of safety can't be overstated. It's the most basic and vital of human needs, and yet it's something that we don't talk very much about. Safety is holistic. If it doesn't feel safe to me to trust or to receive, even again, something as simple as a compliment, then if you're anything like me, you're really, really good at deflecting. You're really good at using humor to be self-deprecating or to water down the significance of things like praise or recognition or validation. Anytime that we're uncomfortable, we have an enormous arsenal of ways to defend ourselves, even when we're not being attacked. So ideally, what we're working towards is allowing people to have their own truth about us and to notice the ways in which our judgment of self tends to be overly self-critical. It tends to be very distorted. It's something that I hear for folks all the time, that if you really knew me, you wouldn't think so well of me, or you wouldn't like me. And that's shame. Unfortunately, a very high percentage of us in active addiction, in early recovery, those of us who are survivors of trauma, we tend to be shame-based and we tend to be fear-based. And so we just assume that other people will see the worst in us. They won't look for what's good about us. They won't appreciate us. And then we kind of complicate or exacerbate this further because we have a tendency to put people up on pedestals and then put ourselves down. And this kind of distance can't really be crossed in most any type of relationship. So we're craving that connection. We want to be able to receive all the healthy things that our higher power wants for us, but there's so many obstacles to that. And the biggest ones typically are the shame that we project and the fears of intimacy, the fears of vulnerability, the fears of just opening up. It's tragic, really, because all of us want deeply to be understood, but we fear opening ourselves up enough to show people who we really are. Again, based in the false belief that we are not enough. I love exploring that with folks. I'll ask, is there some type of criteria, or is there some type of standard for what makes a person good enough? And it's one more thing that typically we haven't examined. And I like pointing out to folks that how we judge ourselves is fundamentally different than the way we judge all other people. So in recovery, for example, we don't judge other people by their past. We don't judge them for things that they did when they were in active addiction. But we don't tend to give ourselves the same courtesy. We tend to define ourselves by the worst things that we've done. And sadly, a lot of the shame that so many of us live with is not a product of anything that we've done, but rather a product of what was done to us. So I'm going to pause just to check for comments and questions. Would love to hear from you. How do you relate to this topic? How do you identify? Okay, whoops. I'm going to get this technology right. Thank you for being patient with me. Shelly, thank you so much. Learning healthy living skills is a huge part of every part of recovery. It's a huge part of resilience. And I think there's a bottom line there where when we don't feel like we know what we're doing, it's really hard to have self-worth. It's really hard to have self-esteem. So the more we build life skills and the more we get basic life need fulfillment, the easier it is to feel like we have worth, to feel like we're moving in a positive direction. There's so many very basic things that we can manage to feel bad about. And again, it's a way in which we would never judge other people. So for example, when I was young, my wife and I were working class poor. We were raising children in a trailer park. And I managed to be ashamed for 10 years. I was apologetic for the way that I lived, for the place that I lived in. And I saw my socioeconomic status as something to be ashamed of. I saw the neighborhood that I lived in as something to be ashamed of. And looking back, that just makes me really sad that I ever saw fit to judge myself that way, because it is not only do I not judge other people that way, it really doesn't impress me at all. If people have wealth, if they have beautiful homes, I couldn't possibly care less. And yet, for a long time, I judged myself that way. Welcome to Crystal and Amy and everybody else who's jumped in. Thank you, Kathy, for the kind words. All positive changes are really hard to make. Accepting this and doing what we need to do to make the hard choices. I think of it the way my friends in NA say it. The only thing you have to really do is become comfortable with being uncomfortable, and then the sky's the limit. You can make all kinds of changes. So I think so much of what we do subconsciously is designed to maintain status quo. So typically we don't examine very heavily where does our self-image come from? How was it created? How healthy were the people that taught us about ourselves? It's one of my favorite questions to ask people that I serve. What do you believe that isn't true? How are you lacking? Because the ways in which we feel that we are not enough are insecurities, of course. And so my earlier example was living in a trailer park, but so many of my friends in recovery are very self-conscious based on things like missing teeth, things like jailhouse tattoos, things like being overweight, things like just on and on and on. We can be judgmental about what we do for a living. We can be judgmental based on things we did in active addiction to get money for drugs. And none of those are the basis in how we judge others, but too often they're a huge part of how we judge ourselves. Juniper, thank you. Any suggestions on ways to begin to forgive ourselves? This is a big struggle I have. This topic hits home. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. My truth, first and foremost, I'm a huge believer in the Keep It Simple system. So the Keep It Simple system says if you know how to do something for someone else, then you know how to do it for you. It works in exactly the same way. So the first thing that I encourage folks to do is to look at the cost of withholding forgiveness. So in any other kind of relationship, we would see this immediately. When we withhold forgiveness, there's two things that are happening. One, we're maintaining resentment, and two, we're creating distance and potentially conflict in relating to that other person. I think we conceptualize forgiveness as something really nice that we do for the person that hurt us. And I say forgiveness can be selfish. I've forgiven lots of people and not even told them. The choice was, I don't want to continue to carry this anger. I don't want to continue to carry this pain. And so my choice to forgive is really more about what's best for me. Now, in the context of forgiving ourselves, that's a hard one because people like me tend to hold resentments against themselves as a form of self-control. We are so afraid that we're going to repeat a behavior or a past choice that we kind of have this idea that if I forgive myself, that it's like giving myself a pass. Or if I forgive myself, it's like saying that it was okay. And instead, what we could look at is forgiving ourselves, first of all, is letting go of resentment, which is healthy all by itself. We could look at, I don't think we view how we relate to ourselves as constituting a relationship, but it absolutely is. I spent a lot of years being my own worst enemy. That was a relationship. I've spent more years now being someone who is fair and respectful to self. I can genuinely say that I like myself very much. I think self-love is really just an ideal that I strive towards. But what I do first and foremost in keeping with forgiveness of self is I use the golden rule in reverse. I try to treat myself the way that I treat other people. I've never struggled to be kind or caring or loving to other people. I was not raised nor taught to be that way to myself. In fact, I was taught to devalue self. I was taught that it was honorable to always put yourself last, always care for others first, and that sacrifice is how you really show love. So the forgiveness of self can be as easy as working through this a 12-step program. What's amazing to me in looking at the steps is that the only things I have to let go of are things that I don't want to continue to carry anyway. And steps 4 and 5 in AA and NA is a process of identifying resentments that we hold, letting go of that pain and anger, acknowledging our part in things. I think there's an awful lot to that. I think we have, if you're anything like me, then you have a tendency to redirect anger and pain that you have with others at yourself. And I also know that part of the cost of surviving trauma is that we tend to repress memories, thoughts, and feelings. So when we bury something, it stays unexamined. So quite often when we start exploring what is it that I need to forgive myself for, it's actually stuff that wasn't my fault. It were things that I blame myself for that were actually done to me. And that is an injustice, right? It's not fair that I should blame myself for how other people hurt me. But it's part of how I maintained some type of control in childhood, in adolescence, and in early adulthood, was if I acknowledged powerlessness and that these were toxic people in my life and they were just going to continue to hurt me. As a child, I didn't have an option to do anything about that, so I reasoned that it must somehow be my fault, and if I was just good enough, then these things wouldn't continue to happen. But as my friends in recovery say, what we lived with, we learned. What we learned, we became. And so what I learned growing up in my family of origin, what I learned through abuse and being bullied, was that these were reflections of my worth. These were reflections of who I am as a person. And so I think a huge part of recovery, excuse me, a huge part of recovery is unlearning lies that were taught to us. A huge part of recovery is coming to a place where we allow people to support us. I know that I hear from everybody. I have trust issues. I have issues with intimacy. I have a fear of vulnerability. And what I've seen is that too often there's no perspective in that. And so the idea of just going out to coffee or having a conversation with somebody at a meeting feels like this black and white thing where I'm either trusting people and opening myself up or I'm not. And I'll confront folks by saying, I don't think it really takes a lot of trust to have a cup of coffee and just talk. You don't have to bare your soul. You don't have to talk about your childhood or your abuse. You could just allow yourself to have some support and make some new friends, recognizing that not only is it healthy for you and necessary, but it's also good for them. Trudy, thank you for writing. I grew up in a housing project. One day a person I knew gave me a ride home with another girl my age. I realized that he was ashamed for me. I was not ashamed, just poor. But as a parent, I did view myself more harshly after providing for my daughter. Thank you. That resonates deeply with me. To be apologetic for being poor or for not having means is a complete injustice. And again, it's not at all how we judge other people. But we, for so many of us, this is a fundamental part of our self-definition, that we are less than others, that we are somehow less deserving or less worthy of love. We are less deserving of respect by virtue of where we live or how we live. And it simply isn't true. But I like pointing towards the well-meaning hypocrisy that so many of us have about that, right? Our judgment of self is fundamentally different than our judgment of others. And that's evident in a million different ways. One of my favorite ways to point this out is that I have all these simple theories. And one of them is, unless you're like a really vain person, you're probably better looking than you think you are. Because if you're like me, when you look in a mirror, all you see are the faults. And I tease the young people that work for me. I'll say, look, I'm old, so I don't care about these things anymore. But every time I look in a mirror, I'm like, good God, you're old. Look at these bags under your eyes. And then I laugh and I remind myself that nobody cares. The people in my life today don't value me because of aesthetics. They value me for my compassion. They value me for my friendship. They value me for the things that I do for my community. They don't care about whether or not I've gained 5 pounds. I'm pretty sure I have. During the pandemic, I've been more than guilty of using food to cope. And I have to remind myself that really at this point in my journey, nobody cares what I look like. So that's an important piece of perspective. You can use that tool anytime. When you're feeling self-conscious, think of it this way. If you ever have to speak in public, this is actually the number one fear. Every time we research common fears that people have, public speaking is always the number one fear. And what's interesting to me is that dying is actually second on the list. Always. It's always that way. So it's kind of funny to me that we're more afraid of speaking in public than we're afraid of dying. So like if you die, at least you don't have to give your own eulogy. You don't have to stand up and talk about yourself, I guess. But when you see someone doing public speaking, typically you're patient with them, you're compassionate, you're kind, because you recognize that what they're doing is hard. But if you step up there to do the public speaking, all of a sudden your inner critic is raging. All of a sudden you're convinced that you're just screwing up everything. I've seen this thousands of times in 12-step meetings, in group therapy, and in other places, where a person speaks from their heart, and then when they're done, they're convinced that they must have screwed up everything, they must have said everything wrong, and they couldn't have possibly been understood or well received. I always encourage people to speak from their heart. If you speak from your head, I'm probably not going to connect with you, and honestly, I'll probably be bored. But if you're speaking from your heart, if you're sharing your experience, strength, and hope, then I'm all about it. I want to hear everything that you have to say, because that's the good stuff, right? That's what I can relate to. That's stuff that connects me to me. All right, I need some coffee. Let's see, what else do we have? Juniper, you're very welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. Really, again, fire off your questions. I'd love to hear what it is that folks want to know. I'm just going to pause and check the other streams real quick for questions. Adam Daniels, does addictive behavior stem from both genetics and psychological issues? Yes. It comes from both. What we can refer to as addictive behavior, you don't have to be an addict to have an addictive mind. This is something that I notice that kind of unites us. Addictive thinking is about a black and white perspective. It's about all or nothing thinking. It's about going to the extremes. It's about the sense of urgency that a compulsion like the need to use creates, but also the compulsion that anxiety creates. Anxiety creates this sense that I have to do something immediately. I have to make this go away. And unfortunately, because of our experience, we often think in terms of, what do I have to sacrifice to make this stop? What kind of manipulation do I have to pull off so that I can just get what I need and feel okay? So genetically, we know that we're predisposed to addiction, to chemical dependency, to substance use disorder. Genetically, many of us are disposed to depression. But honestly, the bigger struggle for most of us is what we learned from our family of origin, what we experienced through the course of growing up. So many of us struggled in public schools, so many of us struggled in our communities, and we lived with stigma and shame. Anxiety is not genetic, but it tends to be a product of experiencing trauma, abuse, neglect, all of the things that we've come to refer to as adverse childhood experiences. I love that concept. I hate that term. An adverse childhood experience to me is a kid that drops an ice cream cone. Like, that's sad. That's adversity. Surviving abuse and neglect is not adversity. It's fucking horrible. So these things continue to shape us, and they have an impact. It's also, I think, one of the biggest benefits potentially to therapy And I differentiate it from counseling. Counseling is about today forward. So what do we need to do? What changes do we need to make? Therapy is about exploring how the past continues to affect the present. So unfortunately, for many of us, the self-image that we have is very different than how others perceive us because they weren't taught to be ashamed of us. They weren't taught to be excessively critical of us. And so that explains the difference in perception. I think positive change is possible by doing something as simple as accepting the compliment, something as simple as allowing people to have their own truth and not fighting against it. Subconsciously, we fight tooth and nail to maintain status quo, even though when we know that change is inevitable, even when we want change. So I encourage people to start by taking a compliment. All you have to do is say smile and thank you. You don't have to agree with them. But I do hope that you'll listen to your intuition. Sometimes people fill us with false praise because they want something from us. But quite often they're good people and they just want to build us up or they just want to empower us a little bit, and that's uncomfortable. So the way that we maintain status quo is don't accept the compliment. Deflect it or water it down or make a joke out of it. Allow other people to have their own truth. Write that shit down. If you really want to get better, anytime you get recognition or praise, anytime someone expresses how much they appreciate you, write it down, journal it. That all by itself will change you. Because what you're going to be confronted with as you remove toxic people from your life and incorporate supportive or helpful people into your life is there's going to be an increasing amount of evidence that what you believe is wrong. And I like to challenge people on this and say, let's examine the people who taught you these things. Were they healthy? Were they sick and selfish? What were they? And that all by itself can create an enormous amount of change. Thank you again. Let's see. Kathy, I recently heard this feels bad quickly becomes I am bad. It helps to see it as feels bad does not make me bad. I agree wholeheartedly. And it's actually an expression of the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is I did bad. Shame is I am bad. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that as well. Quite often, we feel guilty when we've done nothing wrong. We feel ashamed, not because of what we've done, but because of our life circumstances or where we happen to be. I'm a huge fan of dignity. When people are feeling ashamed, they talk to my carpet and they don't look at me. And I'll say, no, wait a minute, come on up here, because all the good stuff's up here, right? When you're looking down at my floor, that just tells me that you're feeling bad about yourself. And I don't want you to change how you feel, but I want to be connected to you. And I want to be able to be helpful to you. And so avoiding eye contact is just a way to stay stuck in where you're at. The eyes really are the portal to the soul. And if I'm looking at you as somebody who cares about you and who upholds your dignity, then that all by itself is going to have a big impact. So I think ideally we're open to that. Thank you again, Trudy. We view ourselves harshly and act negativity without ever becoming a person who has chemical dependency or a substance use disorder. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, we can take some really positive steps, and I don't think of it as being harsh to ourselves. I think of it as being mean. I quite often talk to folks who tell me, I'm just really hard on myself, I just have really big goals, and I'll encourage folks to just notice their self-talk, because honestly, we don't talk to other people the way we talk to ourselves. I think, we're talking to ourselves all day, every day, but it's, again, almost exclusively subconsciously driven. We have to talk to ourselves to get through a day, and every decision and choice that we make and every action we engage in, we're kind of talking ourselves through things. And if you listen really closely to that voice, I think what you'll find is that it doesn't sound anything like how you talk to other people. In fact, it probably sounds like somebody from your past, most often a parent, most often an abuser. And I think that too is a huge opportunity, because I will be damned if I'm going to treat myself the way they treated me. I am not going to be abusive to myself. I can't just change how I feel, but I can always act from a place of respect, and I can act from a place of fairness. And again, I know how to do those with other people. It's very natural, it's very easy, it doesn't take any thought. But when I apply those things to myself, it requires mindfulness. It requires just paying attention to me. And even if I hate how things feel, even if I'm not pleased with my performance or how something turned out, I can still be fair. I can still be respectful. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind. And I guess the final piece that I want to make sure I really touch on is... Sorry, my phone's doing things without my permission. The final piece I want to touch on is allowing ourselves to receive means tolerating reciprocity. And reciprocity is really just a two-way street. Most of us are one-way streets. We give, but we don't receive. So my challenge to you is it takes a lot more vulnerability to receive than it does to give. And if you don't tolerate reciprocity in your life, then what ends up happening is the good people who are in your life can end up feeling selfish because all they ever do is take from you. You don't allow them to give. The way I've come to see it is that my higher power wants me to be every bit as good at receiving as I am of giving. I know that if all I do is give, then metaphorically my cup is empty. And it's my all-time favorite Facebook meme, you can't pour from an empty cup. I was thinking about that recently with my students. I'm teaching a class for people who are about to become therapists, and they're wonderful and they're trying to figure everything out. But when we got talking about the empty cup, I realized a couple of things, because many, many, many times in my life my cup has been empty. And I've experienced a lot of compassion fatigue. I've experienced a lot of burnout, both personally and professionally. And I did that for a lot of years in my career because, again, it was natural for me to give and unnatural, or felt unnatural, for me to receive. So I overcame burnout because I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the way that I did that was I had to change the expectations that I held of myself. I had to examine the standards that I held myself to. I had to examine how productive I demanded myself to be. And I had to do all of that on paper. Because honestly, if I had tried to do those things inside my head, it never would have worked. To varying degrees, I had struggled for most of my life to receive, to allow other people to pour into their cup. What I noticed was that it felt good in the moment, but I never really held on to it for very long. Like, it would feel good for a few minutes, it might feel good for an afternoon, and then it felt like it was gone. It felt like there was this hole in the bottom of my cup. And I guess I can look back and clearly see that I killed myself to earn recognition and praise. I killed myself to impress others and to endear myself, or to get that promotion. But in the end, it was like a drug. It felt good for a little while, and then it went away, and then I felt worse. And I used to blame it on my depression, because my depression is similar to the disease of addiction in that it robs me of joy, in that it distorts my perception, in that it tells me a lot of things that aren't true. And I've been overcoming depression for about 53 years now. It's better than it's ever been, and it remains a work in progress. So I don't think there's a hole in the bottom of my cup. I think I have a responsibility to internalize what is given to me. Not just experience it in the moment, but to meaningfully hold on to it. On rare occasions, you might see somebody in a 12-step meeting. When something kind is said to them, they do this. And this is a conscious act of rubbing it in, of holding on to it. For me, it works well to write those things down, to hold on to sentiments that have been given to me over the years, and to respect those. I've come to see it as a responsibility. The people that I value get to have their own truth, and I don't want to turn away that compliment because it hurts the person who gave it to me. I don't want to diminish their appreciation, their praise, their recognition, because that's not a healthy way for me to relate to them. So I'm going to continue to open up avenues for receiving. And thank you, Adam. It's overcoming depression is something that is a lifelong piece. Part of it's neurochemical, part of it's life circumstances, but more than anything, it's how we relate to ourselves. So I can honestly say I've been getting better consistently for about 20, 25 years, close to it. The best thing I ever did for myself was go into therapy as a client. The best things that I've done for myself are remove toxic people from my life and incorporate people who are very much like me. And it just took me a long time to find those folks. People who are a lot like me are people who are in different forms of recovery, whether that's substance use disorder or trauma or mental illness or any number of self-destructive things that people like me tend to do to ourselves. So not only do I want you to receive and to have excellent self-care and excellent support in your journey for your recovery, and particularly in the midst of COVID, in the midst of everything that we're going through socio-politically, I want everybody to have that support, and I want you to connect with me. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. The first one is to email me, jim@sobernow.com. Would love to get your questions and would love to get topic suggestions that you have. We do these live talks every Thursday at noon. And if there's something that you'd like to see talk about, great. I'd love to hear about it. You can check out our YouTube station. Sober Now is now put out over 100 videos on various aspects of recovery, on mental health and substance use disorder, and those are completely free. All you got to do is head over to YouTube, look up Sober Now, subscribe to the channel, and about once a week you'll get a notification that there's a new video up there. I try to vlog at least once weekly, and that's just another free resource that's available to you. I would love to have you check out our site, sobernow.com. I've been saying this for a little while. It's a work in progress, but we are going to be changing over to a subscription service that is a monthly charge. So for the time being, if you were to sign up today, you can have a lifelong membership with exclusive content for $99, which is a pretty great deal. The program is completely confidential and ensures anonymity. Like, I literally don't need to know your name for you to sign up for the program. There's 2 home study programs there. The first one is for recovery from substance use disorder, and it's accessible from anywhere. It's a daily program for 28 days to help people who are in early recovery or just beginning the process. And then there's a second program for affected others, for people like you and I who have loved ones in active addiction, and how do we take care of ourselves and each other through that process. So please check out all those resources. Please take excellent care of you. I'll look forward to talking to you next Thursday. God bless.